Good afternoon.
Recording in progress.
Good afternoon. It is now 3 o'clock. I'd like to welcome you to the Richland County Detention Center Ad Hoc Committee meeting for November the 21st, 2024. Madam Clerk, could you take the roll, please?
Pugh,
Here.
Walker, English.
Present.
We have a quorum.
Thank you, ma'am. Item 2 on the agenda is the approval for the minutes for September the 24th, 2024.
So moved.
So move. Any changes? Discussion? Okay. Yes. All right, it's been moved and properly seconded. Madam Clerk, call for the vote, please.
Pugh,
Yes.
Walker. Yes. English.
Yes.
Motion approved.
Ma'am? Item number 3 on the agenda is the adoption of the agenda. Mr. Brown, is there any changes or deletions?
There are no requested changes.
All right, Mr. Wright, do you have any changes or deletions, sir?
No changes.
All right, if not, I entertain a motion.
Move to approve.
It's been moved and properly seconded. Madam Clerk, can you call for the vote, please?
Pugh,
Yes.
Walker. Yes. English.
Yes.
Motion approved.
All right. Item number 4 on the agenda is items for discussion and / action. Mr. Brown, you are recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The items that you have today, I just want to speak just very briefly to item 3. It says executive session. That's only if there are particular questions that may arise where the attorney will deem that may be helpful to have an executive session conversation. But ultimately, this will be a general open discussion. And from a general overview perspective, this committee and county council has talked about different ways they can help Alvinus Glen Detention Center. And as a part of that, they've gone from focusing on personnel, focusing on facility improvements, focusing on an overall capital plan, to understanding more about what all the impacts go on with affecting the work at Alvinus Glen Detention Center. And as a result of that, you've asked for a better understanding from different departments and different agencies play a role in affecting what happens in and around Alvinus Glen Detention Center. And to that end, we actually have a couple presenters here this afternoon. We have members of our solicitor's office who are going to be here to talk to us about the role of the solicitor office plays in the detention center and kind of to and from that process. We'll hear also from an organization that's trying to support how they can provide good data for Richland County. That's the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council, who is here, and they'll introduce themselves as well. And then finally, we'll hear from the Association of Counties about policy positions that are relevant to the detention center, and that things that can help, again, better inform this body in how they may want to support and help continue to provide better service to our community through Alvinus Glen Detention Center. So, Mr. Chair, with that being said, the first person I'm going to ask that you are recognized as a member of the solicitor's office. So I'm going to make sure the microphones are on, and we'll have a general overview from the solicitor's office. And if you want to go to the microphone on this side, so Mr. Chair, if that's okay, if there are no initial questions, then we'll hear that general presentation.
Yes, sir. Give me 1 second before we recognize. I'd like to recognize my colleagues that are in attendance. Councilwoman Allison Terratio, and I also like to recognize Councilman Don Weaver. Thank you for joining us in this committee this afternoon. I'm sorry. Miss Mackey, I apologize. Chairwoman Mackey recognized. She's here, a fixture on all committees. So I apologize, ma'am. Sir, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Dan Goldberg. I'm a deputy solicitor in the Richland County Solicitor's Office. Solicitor Gibson sends his regrets. Unfortunately, he's out of town today, so you get his replacement instead for the afternoon. I just want to spend a few moments giving you a bit of an overview of the relationship that our office has, not really with the criminal justice system in as much as it relates to Alvinus Glen Detention Center. And then I'll be happy to answer any questions that you all have. So as you're all aware, obviously our office has an integral part in the system in that law enforcement makes an arrest, they take somebody into custody, They then turn the case over to our office to prosecute the case in court. And, I could spend way more time than you want on how that process goes, but in a nutshell, just so that you're aware, after the arrest, detainees get a bond setting. Some are able to post bond and be out in the community while they await trial. Others remain in the jail. During that time, whether they're incarcerated pretrial or not, we are receiving information from the agency that made the arrest, compiling our case file based on the reports that they have, and putting together our case, and then communicating with defense attorneys to figure out what's going to happen with the case. Is it going to be a guilty plea? Is it going to be a dismissal? Is it going to be a jury trial? Things of that nature. And as that process continues, we are intertwined with the jail on a daily basis. And most commonly, that comes in the form of our courtroom activities. So every given week, pretty much every week of the year, we have court in Richland County. Some weeks we have 2 judges, some weeks we have 1. I think there's only 6, maybe 7 weeks out of the whole year that we have no court whatsoever. Sometimes when we have 1 judge, they'll hear only guilty pleas and motions. Sometimes they will only hear trials. Usually if we have 2 judges, one will be hearing jury trials and the other will take pleas and entertain motions. Naturally, when we're doing these pleas and motions, that involves dealing with defendants who are incarcerated. And so our direct role in dealing with them is multifaceted. Obviously, we are working with defense lawyers on what to do with these cases. How are we going to resolve the cases? So as we're communicating, as we're negotiating with them to get them into court for a guilty plea or to figure out if we're going to schedule a trial, we have to communicate certain things to the defense lawyers. The defense lawyer then obviously has to go communicate with their client. So those that are not on bond and those are down at the jail, they have to go meet with them. And as I'm sure you've been made aware throughout this process, there's been some challenges with that for them over recent years. And so we are left on our side somewhat in a holding pattern at times based upon the restrictions that they face with being able to meet with their clients. That's not any fault of anyone in particular, it's just the scenario that we find ourselves in. And what that does at times is it leaves us having to answer questions that we don't have the answer to. So imagine that you or your family member is the victim of a crime, a significant one at that. And a year has passed, maybe more, and you're waiting for some sort of resolution on what to do with the case. You come to my office and you say, what's going on with the case? And I say, well, we're trying to work it out. I've spoken to the defense lawyer. They're going to go talk to their client at the jail. But then the defense lawyer runs into problems with being able to meet with their client that are beyond their control. And so it slows the whole process down. And then when we have to go back and tell the victim or law enforcement, this is the delay and this is why, they don't really seem to grasp that or really want to hear it, to be honest with you. They just want to know what's going to happen with their case. So that's one thing that directly impacts us by way of what defense lawyers have to do. From a daily standpoint, when you're talking about having court with pleas and motions, the inmates have to be transported to the courthouse. As I understand it, they're transported by Alvin S. Glenn. We send a list. So let me back up. We have a schedule of what's going to be on the docket for the following day. And we have to look and see who's in jail and who's not. So we compile a jail list of who's incarcerated at Alvin S. Glenn. We send that list to the jail the evening before. They then take that and put together the transport list for the next day. I believe they actually transport the inmates to the courthouse, at which point Richland County Sheriff's Department takes over the maintenance, I'll say, of the detainees while they're at the courthouse in the holding cell. The Sheriff's Department staff then brings the inmates up from the holding cell to the courtroom when their case is called. They stay with them for security purposes in the courtroom until their matter is resolved. Then they take them back to the holding cell and they stay there until they're transported back to the jail. We've faced some challenges with the number of folks that can be brought over from the jail on a given day due to staffing issues. I don't know if that's particular to the sheriff's department or Alvin S. Glenn or some combination of both. But we're limited in the number that we can bring over per day and the number that can be in the courtroom at any given time. Another challenge that they face that we have to balance, and we have to balance it in this way. So imagine that there's a docket of 25 guilty pleas and motions scheduled for tomorrow. Our office is tasked with telling the judge, this is what's on the docket, and this is the order in which we're going to present these cases to you for you to hear them. And so we have to balance, well, how many of those are coming in off the street on bond, and how many of them are in jail? For the ones in jail, we can only have so many brought up to the courtroom at a given time. And so we have to figure out what's ready, who can come up, how many can be in the courtroom at a given time. Some of these things are impacted by, are there females that have been transported? Because there are rules about females being in the same area of the holding cells as males. Are there juveniles that have been transported? Our family court prosecution division is a completely separate court from General Sessions Court. They have nothing to do with one another. And so they have their own list of people that's separate. And the juveniles cannot be housed in the same areas as the adults. So depending upon how many females and how many adults there are, that limits how many we can have access to also for our court. So it all kind of interrelates to one another on a daily basis as we're doing this dance of balancing inmates being brought, to the courthouse and then to court. Same thing also would come into play to some extent if someone's in trial, but that's a little bit easier because we know what that situation is. There are instances where we have some cases where folks need to meet with clinicians or doctors as it relates to being evaluated for some of our treatment court programs like drug court or veterans court that are incarcerated but still may be eligible for those programs. It is discouraged, if possible, to have those people brought over to 1701 during court sessions for evaluations because there's a limited amount of space and that's being used for those that are going to court. Same time, the clinicians don't necessarily want to go to the jail to conduct those evaluations. So we have to search for days that are a little bit less crowded to have them transported over so they can be evaluated to see if they qualify for these types of programs. That's kind of a broad view of our involvement with the jail. It's a daily thing. As I said, the most frequent occurrence is this dance that we do of figuring out how many people we can bring to court on a given day and how quickly we can get through them in a safe manner for everybody through a term of court. Of course, we're cognizant of how many people are in jail and the cost that weighs on the taxpayers of this county and of course of Richland County. And so we're trying to get through these as much as we can, as fast as we can. Unfortunately, it just can't seem to get through them fast enough. But that is certainly something that we do keep in mind. And I receive a report every month, as I believe some of you all do as well, from the jail showing how many people are in jail, how long they've been there, what type of offenses they're in. And I share that with our people as well so that they know, there's this many people that have been in jail for over a year on a violent crime. And so we tell them, hey, look, you need to try to prioritize this. We only have so much control over that into how quickly they can be moved in that dockets have a finite amount of space. If we have one trial judge and one plea court, you can only try one case at a time. And so a lot of these folks who've been in there on violent crimes for long periods of time are going to be jury trials. We can only do one at a time, so that kind of adds up and it gets backed up. So without more court time, which we have a lot of court time, but without more, that's going to always be a problem. And so that's just another consideration that we have when we're looking at it. How do I balance what is fair? How do I balance what is just? How do I balance what is right with all these other collateral issues such as overcrowding, overpopulation at the jail, timeliness of dispositions for victims, defendants, their families, things like that. I think I've rambled on for a few moments with an overview, but I'm certainly happy to answer any other questions that you might have about how our office is involved with the jail.
Thank you for the overview. Does anybody have any questions? Councilman Weaver, you recognize, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Goldberg, I think the last report I saw that there had been some lowering of the average numbers of days the inmates have been there, so that's good. But what would you say the biggest holdup is for excessive number of days down there? Like, is it lack of judge time? Is it defense attorneys holding things up? I mean, what's your number one excuse, I guess, for excessive days down there?
I don't know that I can put my finger on one particular thing. I think it's a combination of a lot of things, and every case is a little bit different. Some of the more common reasons for why cases might get old and why people may be spending an excessive amount of time in the jail pre-trial. One could be if there's changes in representation. That's not uncommon. Somebody might be appointed a public defender off the bat. They would have that public defender for perhaps a year. Maybe you're getting close to a resolution, and then they go hire private counsel. Private counsel is going to be afforded time to get up to speed on the case. Could be 6 months, could be more, could be a year. That happens frequently. Other reasons could be waiting on additional materials that both sides need in order to properly evaluate a case. So the Richland County Sheriff's Department has lab services. They do some forensic testing, but they don't do everything. They don't do all types of testing. Not all of our cases are Richland County Sheriff's Department cases, and so Columbia Police Department does not have their access to their own DNA lab, for example. So if it's a CPD case, we have to wait on SLED to conduct that analysis. And of course, they're getting cases from all over the state. They try to handle them as fast as they can. So that can slow things down as well. Additionally, it could be as simple as court time. As I said, we have court virtually every week, but a lot of the people who you're talking about who've been there for a long time, as I alluded to a moment ago, are going to be your more serious cases, your more violent crimes, more likely to either be a jury trial or, if not, at least get scheduled for a jury trial in order to kind of force a disposition, if you will. So maybe you make a plea offer, doesn't sound too good to the defendant. They say, well, I'd rather take my chances with a jury trial. You schedule it for trial, and then once you get on the eve of trial, perhaps it starts to set in, okay, maybe I do need to take some sort of a plea here, but you have to get to that point. And so that can take time because you have to schedule it down the road a bit.
One more question, Mr. Chairman, if I can. Just one more follow-up. So in regards to that, are we doing, compared to other counties that manage the jails, are we doing better as far as number of days inmates are being held? Are we doing worse? Do we know? Do y'all look at that at all?
I don't personally have that information as compared to other jurisdictions around the state. I do have access to information about overall numbers statewide within solicitors' offices in terms of age of cases and on their whole dockets. Now, the caveat to that is us, for example, I think ballpark currently at the jail, there's somewhere around 900 people or so, right? Our overall docket right now has about 8,000 people. So you're talking about a very small percentage of our overall docket that is incarcerated. So when I'm talking about these numbers statewide, I would presume that the percentages would be similar for those places as well. But I can see that overall how old cases are. And as far as that goes, our area, we're kind of middle of the pack with that. We're not the youngest caseload, we're not the oldest. But I don't know the breakdown about other areas and specifically their detained inmates.
It would just be interesting to know how we stand vis-a-vis other counties, somewhere down the road. Maybe that's a good research project for some graduate student at USC or something, so. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Pugh. I need to step out and receive some service. But the next group we have, as you've heard now from the solicitor's office, is going to maybe hit on part of the question that you were asking about data to understand what it looks like at Alvin S. Glenn Detention Center, maybe versus other agencies around the state. And so, Mr. Chair, if you would recognize additional team members from the solicitor's office representing the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council to come to the podium. And if both of you would speak, if you want to take both podiums, that'll be okay. And then we can talk a little bit about the CJCC. They can tell you what it's about. And then from there, we can talk a little bit about the request that will be coming before council to help gather data to further understand what it looks like with Richland County versus other agencies.
Thank y'all very much. You recognize.
Thank you, Council. My name is Hans Pauling. I've been appeared in front of Council before. I've been with the Solicitor's Office since 2009. I was a former public defender and a private defense attorney, so I've been around the block in this county a long time. I want to add to what Mr. Weaver said about data. That's what our CJCC is about. We all know that it's very difficult to make informed decisions if you don't have numbers. And I'm a numbers person, like I'm a freak about it. Like I'll throw out a number right now. In 2013, the solicitor's office closed 10,000 warrants in a single year. We hadn't done that in the 5 or 6 years I'd been there, and it became like a moment for us to cross like a touchdown. 10,000. Well, let me tell you something. 10,000 don't cut it anymore. Our number now is 12,000. And we just hit 10,000 last month in October. We got 2 months left. So just in the space of 11 years, the staff, which is relatively the same size, has now produced and closed out 20% more cases than they did 11 years ago. So that's just part of all of this conversation. Like Mr. Goldberg said, 900 inmates at the jail. Most of them are probably general sessions, but they're family court, they're lower court summary who are being detained, and they could be other transport people who are at the jail waiting to go somewhere else. So, you know, reflective of our overall caseload, if we said 10%, that's probably high. It's probably more like 7.5 or 8%. Ms. Turner is the director of the CJCC, and she was hired by our office last year, and she is working with us at the office to coordinate data collection from Alvin S. Glenn. We're not looking for anybody's names, right? We're looking for demographics to help provide both Alvin S. Glenn and the county what we believe to be informed information to make good choices going forward to help the situation. That's it. We have a good relationship with Columbia Police Department. They have a crisis intervention team that's out there in the community. Richland Sheriff Department, they have a crisis intervention team that's out in the community. I work as a prosecutor in mental health court, which Mr. Goldberg already talked about, right? I also work with Veterans Court, and I work with Juvenile Drug Court. And those of you may not know, I've been the homeless court prosecutor in Columbia for 7 years. And there's quite a few homeless who are at Alvin S. Glenn, at the revolving door. So I think between the three of us, and certainly Alvin S. Glenn, you're gonna have a pretty good information base if you need to ask us questions. We're just missing a public defender. But I was a public defender, but I won't speak for them. But and Ms. Turner, if you'd just like to give them an idea that our memorandum of understanding is just an agreement between our institution and the jail for certain pieces of information that they already probably collect. Some of it they may not. But it's subject to change at the whim of either side. It's not a contract. It's, hey, guys, we want to really try to help work things out, and this is what we need. So I think you guys should have a copy of the MOU. If not, I just have a highlighted version here. And of course, I believe Mr. Brown will share that with you as well. We're not the first to do this. I think Mr. Weaver hit on that earlier, right? Charleston, 2015. Their CJCC did significant amount to impact bond court because of jail population crisis in 2015. So what they did was they hired someone to go into the bond court, to screen applicants before they went in front of a judge, to tell the judge this individual has substance abuse issues, they have mental health issues. We would like the bond to be reflective of treatment while they're waiting the outcome of their case. They don't need to be at the jail. They need to be over here, right? What's the alternative? What's the alternative to Alvin S. Glenn? Well, we kind of probably need that here, right? So we can steer people in the right place, because sometimes people do show up to court. They've been at Alvin S. Glenn for several months, and Alvin S. Glenn will give them their medication, but there's other things that go with mental health treatment, right? Like therapy and counseling and group and all this stuff. And sometimes the medication may not be enough for them to stand in front of somebody and go, yes, Your Honor, I know exactly what I'm doing here today. I've stood next to people and I felt like, can we step down for a minute, Judge? Let me talk to my client again. So I think going forward, providing you all with as much information as we can on the mental health situation and the substance abuse situation at Alvin S. Glenn, and maybe trying to find ways to either bring more services in so we can help that population, and it makes probably the management of the facility a little easier for a staff that is probably somewhat overstressed. And that's what we're trying to do. That's the whole purpose of Ms. Turner's hiring at the solicitor's office and our focus with the CJCC over the last 2 years. So.
Okay. Again, my name is Angelia Turner, and thank you, Hans. The RCCJCC is the brainchild of Hans, and so I appreciate the opportunity to be here. A little bit about my background, though, so that you understand that this is, in fact, really in my wheelhouse. Former professor, taught at Clemson and USC a number of years back. Also worked with the Federal Bureau of Prisons as a researcher and statistician. I worked on a project very similar to this in Tallahassee, Florida, which was called SHOCAP, the Serious Habitual Offender Comprehensive Action Program. And within that program, during those days, we were looking at juvenile crime, and this was back during the late 1980s, but looking at juvenile crime and the crack cocaine problem that was so horrendous during that time, and looking at how to navigate that and provide alternatives for the youth who unfortunately fell within some of those gaps. Today, and I've already spoken with both the director, Mr. Harvey, as well as Dr. Gordon, and we have buy-in from other stakeholders within this area, including, as Hans alluded to, the Columbia Police Department with Chief Hallbrook, SCDC with Jake Gadsden, who's over there reentry and rehabilitation. But again, to focus on the purpose and the premise behind the RCCJCC, we want to, through data and everything that we anticipate doing, is obviously evidence-driven. So as you all make decisions on how to navigate this and place the agency in a better position, we want to be able to provide data looking at mental health assessments and how people are falling through the cracks as it relates to some of the assessments. Are they being treated based on some of the needs? You know, what are the dynamics of the treatment? And even as we think about re-entering back into the community or, you know, transitioning into SCDC, how does that system work? You know, how are we benefiting the folks that we serve in a way whereby, even though the recidivism rate has been decreasing and the programs are admirable within the detention facility, how can we provide recommendations to up that ante and to create some paradigm shifts such that we aren't having the same conversation 5, 10, 15 years from now? So again, as we think about it, behavioral health is one of the main priorities as we think about our focus on data, you know, to the extent that people are being assessed, you know, those assessments, how are they done? What is the process? What is the protocol? You know, how are staff being trained? You know, are there appropriate procedures as part of the overall structure? and to the extent that we can work with the director, and assistant director and staff to make certain that those things are happening. So that's basically the gist of it. We are in conversations also with the CJCC in Charleston and other areas across the state so that we can share resources, share best practices, and make certain that South Carolina is on the map for all the right reasons, as we think about it. Thank you.
My colleagues have any questions? Recognize.
Thank you, sir. My biggest thing, the recidivism rate with that, and this is maybe something that you don't know, but something I'd love to see, is the discharge summaries, the recidivism rate versus the non-summaries that are in place. Because I know sometimes when you have discharge summaries, you have action versus those that don't. And just to see how that would work.
Right, and again, you're right. That's part of some of the questions that we hope to answer. To the extent that people are getting the support that's needed so that those same issues aren't reoccurring and people are at a much better place, moving forward. And so, yes, absolutely, that data is something that we'll work, with the staff to make certain that we can document and provide that summary report.
Thank you, sir.
Thank
Thank
you.
y'all very much. Mr. Brown?
Thank you, Mr. Pugh. Again, members of the committee, that was just an opportunity for us to begin to understand some of the wraparound that goes on that impacts the facility. Now I want to talk and move to some policy positions that you all may not be aware of. I want to have an opportunity to give you some information, and in doing so, would ask that you recognize our friend here presenting from the Association of Counties. If he can come to the podium and introduce himself, and then provide some updates on policies related to detention centers in South Carolina.
You recognize, sir.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Ad Hoc Chair Committee. Thank you, Chairman Pugh, other members of the committee, as well as other members of council, and also Madam Chair of County Council, Ms. Mackey. My name is Kent Lassane. I'm the Director of Governmental Affairs for the South Carolina Association. And in that capacity, I also lead our legislative team, which is responsible for carrying out, trying to implement in terms of getting the General Assembly, I should say, to implement these policy positions that are put forward by the Association of Counties to ultimately become law. We're right at almost the end of our policy development phase. We have the legislative committee that will be meeting in a couple of weeks in Greenville, and they will finalize what will then be the policy positions for the association for the upcoming legislative year. And as you all are aware, our General Assembly works in 2 legislative sessions, so this is the beginning of a new legislative cycle. So that means that they're starting from scratch with all bills being pre-filed and introduced, and any bill that does not become law has at least a second chance in the coming year to ultimately become legislation. So that's kind of where we are. So having said that, the way we work at the association, we have basically 4 overview steering committees that encompass various areas of law. And so in particular, the area that I staff for purposes of this meeting is the Public Safety, Corrections, and Judicial Steering Committee. And here are a couple of the proposed policy positions that are being recommended that would affect directly on the detention centers. Again, understanding that this is not finalized, that will happen when the legislative committee meets in December, but this is what's on the table that will come before them at that time. The first issue is what we refer to as the Safe Harbor Statute. And essentially what this does is that once upon a time, the Department of Corrections, at the request and through a process, would house inmates going into the detention center, but the detention center is really not adequately equipped for it because that inmate poses a particular danger, or because that bringing that inmate into a detention center would pose a risk to them because, again, of other inmates in there. There might be a gang member and other gang members in there, as an example. And so in that scenario, the Department of Correction would house those inmates pending their trial and, ultimately disposing of whatever charges were brought against them. I believe ultimately the department got sued over this practice. And so from a liability standpoint, they decided, okay, we're not going to do this anymore. Well, that doesn't change the fact that there's still that need that exists out there. And so what started maybe about a year or two ago was negotiations going back with the Department of Corrections, finding out how could we implement this in a way that facilitates you all housing those inmates that really should be with you all and certainly is not appropriate to be in a detention center, but at the same time provide you the protection and liability that you all would be concerned about if you brought one of these individuals or individuals into your custody. And so there's a statute in place that would have allowed, I guess, at the direction of the governor for law enforcement or someone to have someone placed in the Department of Corrections, and then within a period of time, for whatever reason, let's say, we had a situation like, when we had doing some of the uprisings, you had someone that was dangerous, the governor could order that person be put in, and then they would put, within 48 hours, they'd have to bring up charges. What this does is it lays out a statutory plan, and we've gotten buy-in already from the Department of Correction that would allow Sheriff's Department or some other mechanism of law enforcement to do a petition for someone that would otherwise be coming into the detention center because they fit this profile to request that the circuit court order that individual to be placed with the Department of Corrections. And again, there's a process, so the inmate can challenge that. But let's say they go through that process and the judge puts that order in place. They then would go into the Department of Corrections. Local law enforcement or the Sheriff's Department would be responsible for all of the transportation back and forth for that inmate, i.e. for their trial or any court appearances. The county or the Sheriff's Department would remain, or the county would remain responsible for any medical attention or care that inmate receives while they're in the Department of Corrections. And so that's just kind of some of the ways that this would play out. So that is a policy position that's being proposed. And I can tell you that I've talked to at least one senator that would be interested in putting this forward as legislation in the upcoming session. So that is one of the policy positions that will be voted on in December. The next one deals with a law that changed. And sometimes when laws are changed, they in one part, they will affect one area, but in the process, they, for whatever reason, deem it necessary to change another part of law. So with that in mind, back in 2010, the General Assembly rewrote our assault and battery statutes. And as a part of that rewrite, they did a couple of things, but two provisions in particular, they repealed. And this dealt with providing enhanced penalties for assault and battery on folks like our corrections officers, our EMS, and folks of that nature. And so one of the proposed policy positions has requested that the legislature put those statutory provisions back in place because, again, as you all are aware, what those individuals in those line of work deal with, they deal with, some dangerous conditions. And unfortunately, even with the laws that are in place, there needs to be some further, penalties, you will, or enhancements to incentivize folks not to be bad actors against those individuals. And so the hope would be that by putting these statutes back in place, is that would be accomplished by that. Another one that actually got implemented, at least on the state level for the Department of Corrections, is the banning of cell phone in jails. And the reason that this is important is that for years, the Department of Corrections has been trying to get the ability basically to jam, to keep cell phones out of their facilities. And the FCC for years has not given states that ability. And so they finally, through much negotiation, worked out something that, according to the federal government, if a certain statute with certain language would be passed, by the state legislature, then that in turn would allow the Department of Corrections to be able to bring in systems so that they could jam and block any cell phone device and control which devices can go in and out of the facilities. So when this legislation started going along, from our standpoint, it was a no-brainer. The same problem is going on in the detention facilities. Let's bring them on along. And so again, the Department of Corrections had no problem with that. Unfortunately, right towards, and this was toward the end of session, we had a member in particular that had some problems with detention centers that essentially held up the bill. And ultimately, in order for it to go forward, they had to remove, because again, he had problems with the detention facilities in his jurisdiction. The detention centers were taken out, so this would have been, this law that went into effect would have also included detention centers, but it did not because of that reason. And so we're gonna try an effort again in this upcoming legislation to try to have that addressed. So any help that you all could give us with members, and again, we can talk off record about exactly how that happened, but that's essentially what we're dealing with here. Another policy, a proposed position deals with the issue of Medicaid benefits for inmates. Of course, one of the problems that happens when someone gets incarcerated and they're on Medicaid, if those services are suspended or terminated, once that individual gets out, it's very difficult for them to start all over and get back into that system. And so rather than having it terminated, one of the proposed policy positions is to have it suspended while they're incarcerated, and any pretrial treatment they got, again, that's not gonna count against them under Medicaid. So suspend rather than terminate. And the final proposed policy position in regards to detention centers deals with the operation of vending facilities by the Commission for the Blind within detention centers. And this has been a matter that's gone back and forth. You have some detention centers where you have folks from the Commission of the Blind that operate vending machines. And so the concern was putting them in secure areas. And so there was a bill that was floated a number of years that came up with a compromise that said, okay, they can come in, but they can only operate those vending machines within non-secured areas. However, if there is a facility where they were actually in a secured and they had been doing that for years, those would be grandfathered in. So it would just be moving forward any new members for the Commission of the Blind that would be operating vending machines. They could only do so in areas that are not secure. So those are the policy positions that are proposed for this upcoming session, and they will be voted on, like I said, in December. And at this time, I'd be happy to entertain any questions that anyone may have in regards to those.
Anyone have any questions? All right, thank you, sir.
Thank you all.
All right, Mr. Brown?
Again, thank you, Mr. Pugh, members of the committee, members of council, and those presenters who were here. Hopefully what this has done is begin to give you an idea of some of the additional opportunities that we're gonna have surrounding improving what goes on with Alvin's Glen Detention Center. Again, you've tackled employee-related matters, you tackled facility-related matters, you've tackled capital improvement-related matters associated with the facility. And now we've talked about what are the next steps strategically, and that's looking at other components that have an impact on what goes on with and around Alvin's Glen Detention Center. And so while some of these things don't require an immediate action, one of the things that you can look forward to seeing relative to items on the agenda is the memorandum. We'll provide that to you in advance of council meetings so you can have an opportunity to consider and review that and have a couple of meetings to decide whether or not there's something that you support us entering into with CJCC. And then depending on what happens at the legislative day of action with the Association of Counties and depending on what policy positions they adopt, I can certainly communicate to you that at least 4 of the 5 that are listed here, if they are approved, I would want us to have the ability, if they become legislation, for us to be able to have a voice in lending our support and speaking up for what we believe to be appropriate related to these items. Again, I know it's a little bit premature right now, both depending on things have not been voted on by that appropriate body and you not deciding, but I wanted to come to you as we've talked about future policy positions, and these are some of the things that I was talking about where I believe that it would be helpful for us if we agree with these things to let our voices be heard at the appropriate time. Mr. Chair, with that statement being made, I'll certainly take any questions that you may have of me, but that will conclude our items for discussion and action on this afternoon.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Does anyone have any questions? Mr. Weaver?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Brown, a couple months back, you and I talked about the feasibility of some kind of citizens relatives committee of inmates down at the jail and maybe seeing if they could make suggestions. Did you have a chance to talk to Director Harvey? Is there any hope on that, or do you think that's getting any traction? Or
That's a good question. And so there's always hope when you're talking to me. And so specifically as a matter of course of action, Director Harvey and I did have a conversation. And we do believe that's something that is very feasible to do. And we believe that we want to do it in a way that the intentions in which you talked about it and that he would like for it to happen, that we don't hit a pitfall. We've taken a lot of steps where we've tried to be receptive to information, and we have ongoing matters, and sometimes the things that you intend to go well have a way of biting you. So we wanted to just make sure that we were able to address a couple of things with ongoing matters and then proceed to that, because that will have the ability to potentially have an impact on some current things that we're dealing with, and we don't want to muddy the water. So in short, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, there was a simple question about how can we better engage citizens who have loved ones, friends, and family, who have concern about opportunities for improvement at the detention center, and separate and apart from council meetings, would there be some way that we could have sort of kind of community meetings related to Alvarez Glen Detention Center? So we are willing to do that. We are just cognizant of our good intentions can have bad outcomes if we don't do it strategically. And so right now, we're just holding off on that until we can handle some issues that are currently ongoing.
okay, thank you.
Mr. Chair?
Yes, sir.
Yes, and I think that before we implement anything like that, we do need to have discussions and conversations about it. I said before anything like that was implemented, we do need to have discussions and conversations about it.
Is this committee, was this committee once called the Blue Ribbon Committee? I remember Ms. McBride speaking about that.
The Blue Ribbon Committee, if you permit me to speak, Mr. Chair, I believe was referencing during the 2015 floods, but relative to part of it transportation and people getting together and providing an overview of what the county should kind of focus on as one of those areas. I don't recall a Blue Ribbon Committee for the detention center. It was about other areas of county government.
Okay. I like to recognize, I missed her earlier, to recognize Councilwoman Shakise Newton, who's online, and she has her hand raised. Ms. Newton, you recognize her. I apologize for not recognizing you earlier.
No problem. Thank you. And my question was following similar lines with Mr. Weaver's question, which is that a few meetings ago, and I don't remember which committee meeting, one of the ideas that was discussed was an idea of bringing county government together with some of the folks that you had here at the meeting today, whether you call it a Blue Ribbon Committee or not, but just for us to talk about some of these interrelated items, because as we know at the county, we're downstream of everything else that happens. We don't commit the crimes. We don't arrest the people. We don't say how long they have to stay in the detention center. We don't run the trials. There are a lot of other people involved. And so I was wondering, that was an idea that was presented to this committee for consideration. Is that still being considered? Is anything happening with that idea of bringing all of the responsible parties together at the same table? Thank you.
Ms. Newton, I don't know if you was able to hear, but Mr. Wright said a few minutes ago, before we move forward with that, we need to have a conversation. Mr. Wright, recognize.
Yes, about the conversation, that's about bringing other members of the public. I think kind of what she's saying is kind of the purpose of the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council, is my understanding. So I think these entities do get together and have meetings and discussions. So it already is in existence, what you're talking about, Ms. Newton.
And Mr. Chair, I'd hate
Yes,
to
sir, Mr. Brown, you recognize.
sound like I'm interrupting, but that specific agenda item that I put on there, I actually attached it to a potential request associated with a possible new facility or an additional add-on. And I talked about having, and I listed out a few parties that I said that may help have the discussion if this council were looking to move forward with, you know, a new facility or add-on to the current facility. And it was kind of a part of that. So I just want to make sure that while I hear the question that's being asked, and the CJCC is a component of that, my specific ask at that time was relative to a potential capital project, and where I was saying maybe these are some of the people you would want to put together who would have interest to provide input and insight based on your consideration.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Ms. Newton, do you still have your hand raised, or that's from earlier?
I raised it again. Just
Ms.
thank
Newton,
you
you
to
recognize.
Mr. Thank you. Sorry. Thank you, Mr. Wright, Mr. Brown, for addressing my question. I guess I didn't understand that previous recommendation or idea before council was exclusively related to facilities. So I will just look at the CJCC and see if that addresses my question. But I do think that there's just greater opportunities for collaboration. And thank you for answering my question.
Thank you, Ms. Newton. Does anyone else have anything? We'd like to thank our colleague, Mr. Paul Livingston, for joining us. Okay, if not, I will entertain a motion for item number 5 on the agenda.
Move to adjourn.
It's been properly moved and seconded. Madam Clerk, can you call for the vote, please?
Pugh,
Yes.
Walker. Yes. English.
Yes.
Motion approved.
We are